Welcome to One Boring Historian. Yes, boring. And no, that's not an insult. Down here, boring means accurate. It means that instead of flashy headlines or overblown myths, we focus on the little details, the quiet truths that shaped how people really lived. Now, I have to warn you, if you came here hoping for a tanks rumbling, or explosion shaking your speakers, this might not be the video for you. Because we're not spending the next 2 hours in battlefields or war rooms. Instead, we're stepping into kitchens, into crowded shelters, into factories, and into the daily lives of ordinary people who found themselves in the middle of the largest conflict the world has ever known. We're going to take a slow walk through World War II from the perspective of everyday life. From Britain's blackout nights to the hunger of occupied Europe, from American ration lines to Japanese fire drills, from Soviet survival in freezing winters to families across Africa, India, and Australia navigating a world turned upside down. So pour yourself a cup of tea, careful with. The sugar, though, that was strictly rationed. Settle in, get comfortable, and let's time travel together. Because our story tonight begins, not with a battle, but with a curtain. Chapter 1. Britain in the Blackout, September 1st, 1939. Britain hasn't even formally declared war yet, but the government knows it's coming, and so. That very night, the lights go out. The order is simple. Cover every window, every lamp, every spark of light that could guide enemy bombers above. The blackout begins, street lamps switched off, headlights painted over, with just a thin slit left to shine through. Households scrambling to pin up heavy curtains. Old blankets, even painted cardboard to block every possible glimmer. It wasn't a suggestion, it was law. If light leaked out of your home, an air raid precautions warden could knock on your door and demand you fix it. In fact, wardens often joked they were Britain's least loved neighbors, constantly patrolling and scolding. But in truth, they played a vital role. Their job was to make sure entire cities vanished into darkness at night, and it worked. Imagine it. London, one of the brightest, busiest cities in the world. Suddenly a sea of shadows, no neon signs in Piccadilly Circus, no glowing shop fronts, just black streets, silhouettes, and silence. People described it as eerie, at first. Frightening, but eventually normal. There's a curious upside too, with the city darkened. The night sky became visible like never before. For the first time in generations, Londoners could look up and see the Milky Way stretching across the heavens. Some found it comforting. Amid all the uncertainty, the stars still shone. Daily adjustments, of course. The blackout didn't just mean drawing curtains. It transformed daily routines. Pedestrians carried torches with shaded bulbs. Some painted the edges of their door frames white so they could find the entrance in the dark. Curb edges were painted too, so people wouldn't trip. And still, thousands of accidents happened. People walked into lampposts, tripped over fences, and collided with each other constantly. There was even a spike in traffic accidents, as drivers struggled to see anything at all. Newspapers published guides on how to walk safely at night. One suggested moving slowly, one hand out in front, as though you were navigating a pitch-black cave. Another recommended carrying a small bell too. Alert others to your presence. Imagine a city of millions, stumbling into each other in the dark, politely muttering apologies. It sounds comical, but for those living it, it was deadly serious. And then there were the shelters. If the blackout was about hiding from above, the shelters were about surviving below. Families were issued Anderson shelters, small, corrugated metal huts buried in the garden, 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, bolted into the earth. and covered with soil. They could fit up to 6 people, though uncomfortably. When the sirens wailed, families would grab their coats, their gas masks, maybe a blanket, and rush outside to huddle in the damp. Cold shelter until the all-clear sounded. In cities where gardens were rare, Morrison shelters were used instead, essentially a steel cage set up in the living room, doubling as a table during the day. At night, families would crawl underneath and sleep, hoping the steel frame would protect them if the house collapsed, and for many Londoners, the ultimate refuge became the underground. Tube stations like Aldway and Bethnal Green filled with thousands of families, blankets stretched across stairwells, mattresses lined the platforms, and children fell asleep listening to the rumble of trains overhead. Over time, some stations even organized libraries, concerts, and religious services underground. Life adapted, while the blackout changed the way people saw their nights. Rationing transformed the way they lived their days. It began in January 1940. At first, it was bacon, butter, and sugar. Each person received a little ration book with coupons, and without those coupons, you couldn't buy the item, even if you had the money. Over time, more foods were added: meat, cheese, milk, eggs, tea, even sweets. It may surprise you that rationing wasn't always viewed as a burden for poorer families. Rationing actually leveled the playing field. Before the war, wealthier households could afford all the meat and butter they wanted, while working-class families often couldn't. But under rationing, everyone got the same fair share. Some said the war gave them the best diet they'd ever had. Doctors even reported improved health among children, fewer cavities, less obesity. Of course, luxuries became near impossible. Bananas disappeared entirely. Children born during the war sometimes didn't taste one until they were 6 or 7. Oranges were rare and often reserved for the sick. And sugar, just 2 ounces a week per person. That's barely enough for a couple of cups of tea. Imagine baking a cake. You'd have to save sugar for weeks, trade with neighbors, or rely on substitutes like carrots or beets to sweeten. Cookbooks adjusted too. Newspapers published endless tips on how to stretch ingredients. Carrot jam became a thing. Potato-based chocolate bars were experimented with. The Ministry of Food even pushed a mascot, Dr. Carrot, to encourage eating more vegetables. Imagine a cartoon carrot lecturing you about health, and you'll get the idea. Then there were the gardens. In 1940, the government launched the Dig for a Victory campaign. Parks, golf courses, even the lawns outside the Tower of London were converted into vegetable plots. Families were encouraged to grow potatoes, carrots, parsnips, anything that could supplement the meager rations. Some even raised rabbits and chickens in their backyards for meat and eggs. It worked. By 1943, nearly half of Britain's vegetables were homegrown. Imagine walking through Hyde Park in London and instead of ornamental flower beds, you'd see neat rows of cabbages and potatoes. The entire country became a patchwork of small, determined gardens, each one a tiny act of resistance against hunger. Food wasn't the only. Daily disruption. For millions of children, the war meant leaving home entirely. In September 1939, as soon as war was declared, Operation Pied Piper began. It was the largest movement of people in Britain's history. Within just a few days, nearly 1.5 million children, mothers with infants, and some disabled people were evacuated from cities to the countryside, where they'd be safer from bombing. Picture it. Long lines of children in school uniforms, each with a small suitcase, a gas mask in a box slung over their shoulder, and a label pinned to their chest with their name and destination. Parents waved goodbye at train stations, often with tears they tried to hide, unsure when they'd see their child again. Some evacuees had positive experiences, welcomed by kind families in quiet villages, discovering wide open fields, animals, and fresh air they'd never known in the city. But others struggled. Some were homesick, some were mistreated, treated as little more than free labor. And when bombing didn't immediately devastate cities as expected, some parents brought their children back home, only to evacuate them again later when the Blitz intensified. One evacuee later remembered, "We were told we were going on an adventure, but all I remember is the silence of the train ride and the smell of fear. For children, the war wasn't about strategy or politics. It was about sleeping in strange beds, eating strange food, and longing for a home. And of course, whether in the city or countryside, children grew up with the sound of air raid sirens, the rising. Falling Whale became the background soundtrack of the war years. At first, kids panicked, clutching gas masks and running for shelter. But over time, many grew used to it. Some even turned it into a game, racing to see who could put on their gas mask fastest, or making funny faces behind the rubber. The irony is, gas masks were rarely needed. Though the government issued over 38 million of them, chemical weapons were never actually used against Britain. But the masks remained, ever present, a symbol of fear and preparedness, and for children, they became an odd companion, a reminder that their childhood was anything but normal. So imagine this. It is 1940. You're sitting in a kitchen lit by a dim oil lamp. Curtains pinned tight to block every speck of light. On the table sits a small plate of bread, a dab of margarine, maybe a spoonful of jam if you saved enough coupons. Your children are sleeping in the Morrison shelter under the dining table. Outside, the city is silent, waiting for the wail of sirens, and in the garden, where roses once grew, small shoots of carrots, and potatoes push up from the soil, the quiet, determined effort of a nation enduring, one meal at a time. Now, let's leave Britain behind for a moment and step quietly into Europe, places where the war felt very different. Imagine walking through the cobblestone streets of Paris in 1941. The cafes are still there, the Seine still glitters. Notre Dame still towers, but everything feels subdued. The French capital, once alive with laughter and late-night music, now moves under the heavy boots of German occupation. Signs are in German as well as French. Soldiers in grey-green uniforms march past street corners. For ordinary people, life became an act of careful balance. You had to get food, go to work, care for your family, all while avoiding suspicion, curfews and punishments. The war wasn't fought only on battlefields. It was fought in queues outside bakeries, in whispers exchanged between neighbors, and in the way people navigated the tiniest choices each day. Rationing in occupied countries was often harsher than in Britain, in France. A typical adult was allowed about 1,200 calories a day, less than half what a healthy person needs. Bread was grey and coarse, made with fillers like chestnut flour or even sawdust in some regions. Meat was nearly impossible to get. Coffee disappeared, replaced by chicory root. People queued for hours for a small portion of butter or a handful of potatoes. Some kept rabbits or chickens in backyards, even in cities. Black markets thrived, but prices were sky high, and only the wealthy could afford them. The French woman later recalled, "We were always hungry. Always. You thought about food when you woke up. And you dreamed about food when you slept. But amid the hunger, there was also creativity. Housewives learned to stretch every scrap, to invent meals out of almost nothing. A stale crust of bread became soup. Beetroot leaves were boiled as greens, and when nothing else was available, people chewed chestnuts, hoping it would quiet the stomach long enough to fall asleep. In Paris, Brussels, Amsterdam, the rhythm of life was dictated by curfew. Most cities required citizens to be indoors. By 9 or 10 at night, streets that once bustled with laughter and music fell eerily silent. Windows were shuttered, lights dimmed, only the sound of German patrol boots echoed on the cobblestones. Imagine being a teenager in 1942, forbidden to meet friends after dark, unable to sneak to the cinema or dance halls. Instead, evenings were spent round dim candles, families reading or sewing quietly, listening in secret to the crackling voices of forbidden radios tuned to the BBC for children. The absence of noise became a memory in itself. One Dutch evacuee later said, "The quiet was louder than the warplanes. You could hear your own heart beating." And yet, even under occupation, people found small ways to resist. In the Netherlands, bicycles became a symbol of independence because gasoline was scarce. Most people relied on bikes, and when German soldiers tried to confiscate them, locals sometimes removed pedals, chains, or tires, rendering them useless. In Belgium and France, bakers or shopkeepers might slip an extra piece of bread to a child. Teachers taught band lessons in secret. Musicians played songs laced with double meanings. Slipping jokes past censors, some women resisted in their own quiet way, refusing to smile at. Soldiers, wearing their dresses plain, keeping their pride even as uniforms filled the streets. Others chose bolder paths. Careers for the resistance were often young women, who could travel with messages hidden in loaves of bread or baskets of laundry without raising as much suspicion as men. For children, daily life in occupied Europe carried both strange normality and sudden danger. In France, school continued, but lessons sometimes included German propaganda. Children were encouraged to salute or sing songs praising their occupiers. Yet after class, they whispered jokes about the soldiers, mimicking their accents or giving them silly nicknames. In the Netherlands, Jewish children faced the harshest reality at first. They were forced into separate schools, wearing yellow stars sewn onto coats. Later, many were deported. Neighbors remembered the silence that fell when children disappeared from playgrounds and classrooms, their laughter gone forever. But not all was grim. Some children found small joys, playing marbles with pebbles, drawing chalk games on cobblestones, or chasing each other through fields when no soldiers were near. To a child's eye, the war was both terrifying and ordinary, a mixture of fear and games, hunger and imagination. Perhaps the most haunting thing about occupied Europe was the atmosphere of waiting every day. Felt stretched, uncertain, waiting for food deliveries, waiting for a curfew to lift, waiting for letters from loved ones, waiting for the war to end. A Parisian diary entry in 1940 simply read, "Today we queued for bread. Tomorrow we will queue again. The line is endless, and so is the war, and yet, through that waiting, life continued. Couples fell in love, babies were born, friends gathered in whispered circles, humanity persisted. Even in the shadows of occupation. So picture this. You're walking through Amsterdam in 1943. The canals are still, reflecting faint light from shuttered windows. Bicycles lean against walls, stripped of tires to prevent confiscation. In the distance, you hear the echo of boots on cobblestones, but inside a small apartment above a bakery, a family gathers in silence, listening to a hidden radio. The announcer's voice is faint, crackling with static, but the words pierce the gloom. This is London calling, and for a moment, hope feels just a little closer. Softly, gently, Let's drift onward. Our story continues, not on the battlefields, but in the gentle rhythm of markets, kitchens, and family tables across the world. Because while armies marched, millions of ordinary people carried on with the quiet business of living, adapting, and hoping. Our story today sets us down in a small Chinese farming village in the early 1940s. The countryside is vast, green, and heavy with rice paddies. You can almost hear the buzzing of dragonflies skimming the water's surface. Families here live under the shadow of invasion and war. But the everyday sound is the splash of wooden sandals on the muddy ridges between fields. Villagers whispered to one another about rationing, about bandits, and about rumors of soldiers passing through. But in the evenings, as dusk settled, families gathered on low stools around simple clay stoves. Bowls of rice, flavored with pickled vegetables, warmed their hands. Children chased fireflies in the dark, laughter echoing softly, briefly masking the worry of uncertain days. Did you know, during the war, people in rural China developed countless small ways to stretch food. Dried sweet potato leaves were used as greens. Acorns were ground into flour. Nothing was wasted. Even hardship had its ingenuity. Close your eyes and imagine the smoke from a wood fire curling upward, the smell of earth after rain, and the quiet pride of people who carried on with dignity in the hardest of times. Now, let us drift thousands of miles west, to Cairo, Egypt. It is 1942. The war has brought British troops and Allied forces into North Africa, and Cairo has become a hub of movement. But step into a market street, and the timeless rhythm of life continues. Vendors call out over pyramids of oranges, figs, and pomegranates. Spices fill the air: cumin, cinnamon, saffron. A boy carries a tray of tea glasses, weaving between donkeys loaded with baskets. Life was not untouched by war. Blackouts dimmed the evenings, and ration books appeared here too. But Cairo also became a place of music and escapism. Cafes filled with the sound of Kulthum's voice on the radio, a singer whose songs carried the soul of a nation. Soldiers and locals alike found comfort in her voice. Close your eyes and imagine the mingled scents of tobacco smoke, sweet mint tea, and warm bread, a reminder that even in a world turned upside down, people sought comfort in the familiar. Now, across the ocean, we find ourselves in a modest Canadian kitchen. A mother stirs a pot of soup while the radio hums in the background with both jazz and wartime updates. Her children sit at a wooden table, working carefully on letters to their father who has enlisted overseas. Outside, the prairie wind whistles through the thin windows and snow presses against the glass. Canada, like many nations, introduced rationing meat, sugar, butter. Families learned to bake with honey or molasses instead of sugar. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards, even in the chill of Manitoba and Ontario. Did you know school children in Canada collected scrap metal, tin foil, and even old rubber tires to contribute to the war effort? Every little thing had a second use. Imagine the warmth of that kitchen, the scent of bread rising despite the lack of butter, and the comfort of radio static filling the silence. The ordinary work of family life, strong enough to bridge distance and absence. Finally, let's drift toward the Indian subcontinent. Picture the vast train stations of Delhi or Calcutta. In the 1940s, heavy steam locomotives releasing clouds of smoke, people moving in endless streams across wide platforms. British officers stood in uniforms, while Indian laborers carried crates, luggage, and supplies. Street vendors sold spiced tea in clay cups, their voices rising above the churning wheels. India was under British colonial rule, and the war brought both opportunity and strain. Textile mills produced uniforms, farmers were pressed to grow grain for soldiers. Yet famine struck in Bengal in 1943. leaving devastation in its wake, and still, life carried on. Weddings took place in villages. Processions filled with music and marigold garlands. Children flew kites from rooftops. Strings cutting through the blue sky. Imagine standing on that crowded platform. The smell of coal smoke, fried snacks from a vendor's cart, and the bright sound of a sitar carried from somewhere beyond the crowd. War pressed heavily here, but life never stopped unfolding, and so, in this gentle journey, we've wandered far, from Chinese rice paddies to Egyptian markets to Canadian kitchens to Indian train stations, each one whispering the same truth, that history is not only battles and leaders, but the slow, steady heartbeat of everyday people, their cooking, their songs, their laughter, their resilience. Softly, softly, let those images drift with you now, as if you are walking through time, yet always surrounded by the warmth of ordinary life. Softly now, let's step into new places, where the rhythm of life in wartime beats quietly against ocean waves and farm winds in the Caribbean. A port at twilight, our story today sets us down in Kingston, Jamaica, in the 1940s. The war has reached even these sunny shores. Merchant ships, carrying sugar and bananas, slip in and out of the harbor while the threat of German U-boats lurks just offshore. But here, on the docks, workers unload cargo to the sound of gulls crying and wave lapping. In the evening, calypso music drifts from taverns and street corners. Musicians strum guitars and sing clever verses about local life. Mixing humor with hardship, children dance barefoot in the dust, while their mothers prepare rice and peas with coconut milk. Stretching meals to feed every hungry belly. Did you know Caribbean workers were recruited to serve in Britain's war industries, with thousands traveling across the Atlantic to drive buses, nurse the sick, and work in factories? Their contributions were vital, though often overlooked. Close your eyes and imagine the humid air, the glow of lanterns on wooden boats, and the steady pulse of drums reminding everyone that life and song must continue. In the Andes, a Peruvian village, now let us drift to the highlands of Peru, where life beats to the rhythm of the mountains. The Andes stand tall, snow-capped, as farmers tend to potatoes and quinoa. In the 1940s, Peru was far from the front lines, but even here, the war tugged at daily life. Exports of minerals and food increased, shaping the routines of farmers and merchants alike. Picture a small village square, women in brightly woven shawls selling baskets of corn, children herding llamas along cobbled paths, and an old man playing a quena flute whose song echoes like the wind itself. Did you know quinoa, now considered a superfood, was a staple for Andean villagers long before it became fashionable? In the wider world, during the war years, it sustained countless families when wheat and imported flour were scarce. Let yourself breathe in the thin, crisp mountain air. Imagine chewing coca leaves to ease the altitude, sharing warm chicha in clay cups, and watching stars spill across the dark Andean sky. In Australia, a coastal town now, softly, let us arrive in a small coastal town in Australia. It is 1942, and the war has reached the Pacific. Japanese submarines have attacked Sydney Harbour, and fear lingers along the coasts, but still, in towns like Fremantle or Cairns, the rhythm of fishing boats and sandy beaches carries on. Imagine walking along a pier where fishermen mend nets by lantern light, the smell of salt and seaweed heavy in the breeze. Children dig in the sand nearby, their laughter rising above the surf, while their parents discuss ration coupons, sugar, tea, even clothing were limited by strict rules. Did you know Australians created victory rules, a clever hairstyle for women? As a symbol of resilience and patriotism, the curls were practical, too. keeping hair neat for factory work. Even fashion bent to the will of the war. Close your eyes, hear the waves crashing against rocks, and see the Southern Cross glowing above the ocean. Even with fear near, the vastness of the sea offered a strange kind of calm. In New Zealand, on a sheep farm further south, across the Tasman Sea, lies New Zealand. Here, the war meant an enormous demand for wool and meat. Sheep farms stretched for miles, and the gentle bleating of flocks became part of the soundtrack of wartime production. Farmers woke before dawn, mist rolling across hills, to shear sheep and send wool for uniforms that soldiers would wear across the globe. Imagine standing in a barn filled with the soft, lanolin smell of freshly shorn wool, the rhythmic snip of shears, the bark of sheepdogs, and the laughter of farmhands blend into a pastoral symphony. Did you know New Zealand sent not only food and wool, but also soldiers, many of whom served in North Africa, Greece, and Italy. Yet back home, the land remained alive with the steady patience of farming life. Feel the softness of wool in your hands, the crunch of gravel underfoot, and the sense of connection between these quiet hills and the distant thunder of a war ocean's way in the Pacific Islands. A coconut grove finally. Let us drift to the Pacific Islands. Perhaps Samoa or Fiji, the war brought soldiers, ships, and airplanes to once quiet beaches. Changing life forever, but in the villages, under the tall swaying palms, families still gathered in open-air fails, cooking taro, breadfruit, and fresh fish over open fires. Picture a moonlit evening where the air is thick with the smell of roasted pig and sweet coconut. Villagers sit cross-legged on woven mats, singing hymns or telling legends of the sea. Children fall asleep to the rhythmic crash of waves, while elders remind them of ancient navigators who once sailed by stars alone. Did you know many Pacific Islanders were recruited as laborers? Scouts or coast watchers during the war, their role in monitoring Japanese movements was crucial. Though often unsung, close your eyes and hear the ocean, vast and eternal. Imagine lying in the sand, feeling the warmth of the earth beneath you, knowing that life here has always followed the tide, long before and long after the war. Closing this chapter and so, we have drifted across oceans and islands, from Jamaica's ports, to Peru's mountain villages, to Australia's sandy shores, to New Zealand's woolly hills, to the coconut groves of the Pacific, each place whispering the same reminder that in the hardest of times, people found rhythm in markets, in farms, in music, and in meals shared under the stars, softly. Softly, let these images carry you deeper into calm. History is vast, but it is also personal. It is in the clatter of pots, the rhythm of shears, the cry of gulls, and the hum of lullabies that carried whole families through uncertain nights. Softly now, let's drift once more. The story of World War II is often told in clashes of armies, in maps and borders. But another story lives in the streets, alleys, and apartments of great cities. Cities that did not sleep, even when bombs fell, even when shortages thinned the cupboards, even when fear pressed down like fog. Tonight, we step quietly into those cities. We won't hear the roar of tanks or planes, but the clatter of pots, the shuffle of ration lines, the faint notes of music leaking from radios. Come with me as we wander from Moscow's frozen streets to the jazz-lit corners of New York, from Tokyo's tightly bound wooden houses to the somber pulse of Rio, and then further still to Nairobi. A colonial hub caught between tradition and change. Each city whispering a reminder that even in strain, life continues. Our story today begins in Moscow, 1942. Close your eyes and feel the air grow colder. The Russian winter, sharp and unyielding, wraps itself around the city like an iron cloak. Streets are lined with snowdrifts. Wooden houses send thin plumes of smoke into the sky. Somewhere, church bells ring faintly, muffled by the wind. The war presses hardest here. Food is scarce. Women rise before dawn to queue in long lines, waiting for bread that is weighed carefully, almost reverently, by shopkeepers. Imagine standing in that line, your breath rising like smoke, boots stiff with frost, a ration card clutched tightly in your mitten. Children, bundled in wool scarves, drag small sleds across icy lanes, carrying bundles of wood home to keep the stove alive for just one more night. Men, tooled to fight, repair tools, patch roofs, and whisper about sons and brothers at the front. Yet Moscow does not sleep. In hidden corners, poetry is read by candlelight. In kitchens, families share bowls of cabbage soup, thin but warm. And at night, as blackout curtains are drawn, songs rise softly, old Russian lullabies, carrying children into uneasy dreams. Did you know, during these years, many families kept chickens inside their apartments, or even rabbits, to secure precious protein? The clucking and scratching were as common as footsteps on the stairwell. Imagine that now, the quiet coo of a hen by the stove, the scrape of boots at the door, the steady entrance of a city wrapped in snow, carrying on. Now let's drift across the ocean to New York. It is 1943. The city is buzzing, alive with a rhythm that refuses to slow, even in war. The skyline is lit with factory smokestacks and neon. The windows are shaded for blackout precautions. The subway roars underground, carrying men in uniforms and women in factory overalls, their lunch pails clanking like bells. On the docks, cargo is loaded for Europe. Liberty ships rise and fall with the tide, their hulls filled with supplies that will feed soldiers overseas. Longshoremen shout, gulls scream, and somewhere in the distance, a saxophone plays. Step into a diner. A waitress pours coffee into chip mugs, smiling at soldiers on leave. Sugar is rationed, so pies are baked with honey or corn syrup. Imagine the smell of grilled onions, the crackle of bacon, and the clink of silverware against porcelain. The chatter is light, though always circling back to the war. And at night, New York offers escape. Jazz clubs in Harlem swing with the music of Count Basie and Duke Ellington. Couples dance close, forgetting, just for a while, the headlines. In Times Square, posters shout by war bonds, while theaters still show newsreels before every film. Did you know the iconic nylon stockings disappeared during the war because nylon was diverted to make parachutes? Women painted their legs with liquid stockings, even drawing seam lines with pencils to mimic the real thing. Close your eyes and imagine it. The horn of a taxi, the crackle of a newsboy's shout, the soft scuff of shoes on a dance floor. A city alive, straining under war, yet never losing its heartbeat. Now we turn eastward to Tokyo. It is 1944. The war weighs heavily, yet life continues in narrow streets and wooden houses. Step quietly, and you will hear it. The clack of getter sandals on pavement, the rustle of laundry hung from bamboo poles, the faint rattle of a handcut as a vendor calls out his wares. Everyday life in Tokyo was a careful balance. Rice was rationed, so families stretched meals with millet, sweet potatoes, or chestnuts. Imagine a mother stirring a pot, the scent of miso broth filling a tiny kitchen, while her children fold paper lanterns by the light of a dim lamp. Air raid drills became routine. School children practiced with buckets of sand and water, forming lines to extinguish small fires. At night, blackout curtains shrouded the city, leaving only the soft hum of cicadas and the bark of distant dogs. Yet beauty lingered. Cherry blossoms still bloomed in spring, pink petals drifting into quiet canals. Temples still opened their gates. Neighbors still gathered for festivals, though the music was subdued. And in every home, there was the steady rhythm of life, sweeping, cooking, praying, enduring. Did you know paper windows, made of shoji screens, grew scarce as supplies dwindled? Families patched them with scraps of old cloth or newspaper, letting in only fractured light. Close your eyes. Imagine tatami mats beneath your feet, the sound of bamboo swaying outside, and the quiet determination of families who endured the strain of war with ritual and grace. From Tokyo, let us drift to South America, to the shores of Brazil. Rio de Janeiro in the 1940s was vibrant, even under the shadow of war. The beaches stretched wide and golden, while the streets filled with the rhythm of samba. But life, too, was touched by rationing, by shortages, by news of submarines lurking along shipping lanes. In the markets, women bargained for beans, rice, and cassava flour, stretching meals to feed large families. In the evenings, radios crackled with both war reports and music, the smooth voice of samba singers carrying through open windows. Carnival, that great burst of color, was subdued during the war years, but not extinguished. Costumes were sewn with recycled fabrics, and parades grew smaller. Yet people still danced, because dancing, like breathing, could not be taken away. Imagine the scent of roasting coffee drifting from a street cafe. Imagine barefoot children playing football in narrow alleys. Imagine young men in pressed white shirts listening eagerly to news of Brazil's Pracinhas, soldiers who would fight in Italy alongside the Allies. Did you know Brazil was the only South American country to send troops to fight in Europe during WWI? Over 25,000 soldiers joined, while the home front pulsed with both sacrifice and celebration. Close your eyes now. Hear the sway of a guitar, the murmur of waves against Copacabana's sand, and the warmth of a people who carried joy even through strain. And finally, let us drift to East Africa. Nairobi, 1940s. A colonial city, bustling yet divided. The streets were filled with contrasts. British officers in starched uniforms, Indian shopkeepers ranging spices, African farmers bringing in baskets of maize and bananas. The war reached here, too. Nairobi became a supply hub for the Allies, its airfields busy with planes, its railways carrying goods to and from the coast. Prices rose, goods grew scarce, and ration books appeared in markets. Step into a small shop. The scent of cardamom, cloves, and tea leaves hangs in the air. Customers bargain quietly, ration coupons laid on wooden counters. Outside, barefoot children chase each other through dusty streets, their laughter rising above the hum of the city. And in the evenings, families gathered. Radios played dance tunes, sometimes in English, sometimes in Swahili. Drums echoed from distant neighborhoods. Even under strain, life pulsed in rhythm, a blend of traditions meeting in one place. Did you know many Kenyans, Tanzanians, and other East Africans were recruited as soldiers, drivers, and porters in the King's African Rifles? Their service stretched across Africa and Asia, though history often overlooked their contribution. Imagine the air now, warm, fragrant with wood smoke and earth. Imagine sitting beneath a jacaranda tree in bloom, its purple petals falling softly to the ground, while a city carries on beneath the long shadow of war. And so, tonight, we have walked through 5 cities under strain. Moscow, bundled against winter. New York, alive with jazz and industry. Tokyo, subdued yet enduring. Rio, colorful even when muted. Nairobi, a crossroad of cultures and sacrifice, each one strained by war, but each one refusing to stop living. Softly, softly. Let these images rest with you. Cities are more than stone and steel. They are the hum of voices, the taste of food, the songs that linger even when the world trembles through strain. They remind us life continues always. Softly now, let us step into the small shoes of children. Wars are often told through generals, through battlefields, through governments. But beneath all of that, there were children. Children whose worlds were reshaped, whose games, meals, and lullabies carried shadows of a conflict they did not choose. Let us wander gently through the eyes of childhood, from London's evacuees to Polish ghettos, from Japanese classrooms to African villages, and across to America's schoolyards. It is 1939. In London, children stand in long lines. Gas masks slung over their shoulders like small satchels, labels are pinned to their coats. Like tags on parcels, trains wait at crowded stations. Mothers lean down for one last kiss. One last whispered prayer. Children clutch teddy bears, dolls, or a favorite book and step aboard, bound for the countryside. The evacuation moved over 3 million British children during the war. City kids found themselves on farms, in villages, sometimes in grand houses, sometimes in poor cottages. Imagine being 6 years old, arriving in a strange town, holding a stranger's hand, sleeping in a bed that smelled different than home. Fear mixed with wonder for some. It was adventure. For others, loneliness pressed like stone. At night, they wrote letters. Dear Mom, I am safe. When will I see you again? Now let us drift to Poland. In the Warsaw ghetto, children's laughter still echoed, faintly, stubbornly, against the weight of tragedy. They played tag in narrow alleys, skipping over cobblestones. Even as hunger gnawed at their bellies, smugglers, many of them children themselves, crawled through sewers or slipped past guards, carrying potatoes, bread, onions, risking everything, so their families might see another dawn. Imagine a girl with a ribbon in her hair, carrying a loaf of bread bigger than arms, her eyes darting as soldiers pass. Imagine a boy clutching a marble, a scrap of his old life, rolling it in his palm, while the world crumbles round him, even in the darkest places. Childhood refused to vanish, now to Tokyo, Kyoto, Osaka. In classrooms, children sat on tatami mats, reciting lessons. Yet school was not the same. Songs praised the emperor. Maps showed a world at war. Older boys practiced with bamboo spears. Girls stitched socks and bandages for soldiers. Air raid drills became routine. Teachers led lines of children into trenches, their small hands clutching buckets of sand to smother imaginary flames. And yet, recess still came. Children still skipped rope, still flew paper kites in open fields. Imagine a kite soaring against a darkened sky, carrying joy into a world too heavy for small shoulders. Far away, in West Africa, childhood looked different, yet was still touched by the war. Children fetched water from wells, carried baskets of cassava, helped pound yams in large wooden mortars. They heard their parents speak of soldiers sent overseas, of food prices rising, of strangers passing through their towns. But afternoons still belonged to play. Barefoot children raced along dusty pods, chasing wheels with sticks, singing call and response songs that echoed through the village. Did you know? Many African children first saw airplanes during these years, as Allied planes crossed their skies or landed at new bases. To them, It was as if giant birds had come from the heavens. Imagine standing there, a child shielding their eyes from the sun, mouth open in wonder, watching the war arrive not as a battle, but as a machine glinting high above. And now, across the ocean, to America. In small towns, children collected tin cans, newspapers, even bacon grease, all for the war effort. Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts knocked on doors. Gathering scrap, at school, kids recited the Pledge of Allegiance. Then practiced blackout drills by ducking under desks. Sugar was rationed. So mothers baked cookies with molasses or corn syrup. Birthdays came with fewer sweets, but still with candles and songs, and yet childhood thrived. Baseball games on dusty fields, roller skates on sidewalks. Radio shows that carried young imaginations far from war. Did you know? Comic book superheroes. Like Superman and Captain America rose to fame in these years. Giving children heroes who always triumphed against evil, for many, it was a reminder that good could still win. And so, softly, softly, we have walked with children. London evacuees whispering in countryside beds. Polish boys and girls clutching bread and marbles. Japanese students folding kite sand. Sand buckets, African children chasing wheels through red dust. American kids trading sugar for. Scrap drives, yet still cheering heroes in comic books. The war reshaped their days, stole some of their innocence, yet never silenced their laughter. Close your eyes, and you might hear it, faint but clear. The sound of a skipping rope hitting pavement. The giggle of a child hiding in a game of tag. The soft hum of a lullaby sung against fear. For even in war, children remained children. And their voices, fragile and strong, remind us hope endures. We've walked through kitchens and fields, through cities and ships, through the small shoes of children. Now, let's lean into something even more human, the ways people comforted themselves and one another when the world felt uncertain, because in the quiet of evenings, when the radios clicked on, when hands opened books, when prayers were whispered into the dark, people found anchors, and those anchors were music, stories, faith, and simple rituals. Picture this. It's night in London. The blackout curtain is pulled tight. Outside, sirens may wail, or the hum of planes may pass overhead. But inside, a family gathers round the radio, and then a voice begins to sing. Violin, we'll meet again. A song became the hymn of hope for an entire nation, a promise whispered through static that one day loved ones would be home again. Imagine the mother tapping her fingers against her teacup. A soldier's letter sits unopened on the mantel, the children lean in, sleepy, as the voice carries them gently into dreams. Did you know even soldiers at the front requested her records, longing for that same voice, that same reminder of home? Music gave what words alone could not. Reassurance. Now, let us step into a Russian apartment in Moscow. It is winter. Frost climbs the window panes. Bread is scarce, but a grandmother recites lines of Pushkin or Lermontov, poems learned long ago. The cadence fills the room like a second fire. In the Soviet Union, poetry and songs became survival tools. Soldiers carried scraps of poems in their pockets. In besieged Leningrad, orchestras played even as bombs fell, their bows trembling against frozen strings. Close your eyes. Hear the faint strains of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, performed in a starving city, each note defying despair, now across the ocean to an American living room. The war is far away, but the impact is felt. Families huddle near their radios after supper. They listen to Roosevelt's fireside chats, his calm voice making distant battles feel just a little less terrifying. But it wasn't only politics. Radio dramas like The Shadow or Little Orphan Annie filled the airwaves, pulling children and adults alike into other worlds. Stories became escape hatches. Little windows into hope, laughter, or suspense. Picture a child curled up on a rug, chin in hands, imagining a caped hero defeating villains, while outside ration posters flutter in the wind. In Japan, war brought fear into every household. Yet before bed, families still gathered at their Butsudan, the Buddhist altar, incense curled upward, thin and fragrant, hands pressed together. Silent prayers were whispered for fathers, brothers, sons at the front. Imagine a young boy, kneeling, his small voice joining the chant of his mother. Outside, the air raid siren sometimes broke the night, but inside, the rhythm of prayer wrapped them in calm. Even Shinto shrines, scattered across small towns, became centers where children tied paper fortunes, wishing simply for peace and return. Now, softly, to Africa again. In Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, music was daily life. Drums beat in the evenings, voices lifted in call and response, sometimes singing of hardship, sometimes of joy during the war. African workers and soldiers carried these songs with them across oceans, on ships, in barracks. Even in European fields, African rhythms echoed. Picture men stomping feet in unison, clapping hands against wood, the beat carrying strength into weary bones. Did you know, in some villages, songs were crafted about the war itself, both mocking its reach and reminding listeners that community remains stronger than fear. Now, let us drift to India, a small village lit by lanterns. The air buzzing with insects, children gather round their grandmother, who tells ancient epics, stories of Rama and Sita, of the Mahabharata. Even as ration shortages pressed hard, even as political struggles grew, these stories gave continuity, a reminder that the world had endured great trials before and would endure again. Imagine sitting cross-legged in the warm dust, eyes wide, as words paint heroes and gods larger than life, while the scent of curry and smoke drifts through the evening air. And so, softly, softly, we see. Britain sang through the voice of violin, Russia recited poetry against the cold, America tuned into radio dramas and fireside chats, Japan prayed before sleep, Africa drummed and sang resilience into the night, India told ancient stories by lantern glow. The war reshaped lives, but in the quiet of evenings, people turned to music, stories, and rituals. And in those moments, they remembered something timeless. The human heart endures through song, story, and silence. Close your eyes now. Hear the radio hum, the drumbeat echo, the hush of whispered prayers. Feel yourself sink into calm, as generations before us once did. Waiting for a dawn to come, softly, gently, let us listen to the echoes of men. For while the world called millions of men into uniform, their absence shaped homes, villages, and cities as much as their presence once did. It often began with a train whistle. Men kissed their wives, their mothers, their children, and marched away with duffel bags slung over shoulders. Some wore crisp new uniforms, others carried only old coats and patched boots. Did you know, by 1945, more than 100 million men around the globe had been mobilized for a military service? Close your eyes and hear the shuffle of boots on a platform, the forced cheer in a father's last wave, and the silence that follows when he's gone. Men at the front, letters across the divide. For soldiers, daily life was mud, marches, barracks, and waiting. But through the distance, they wrote. Letters carried across oceans, and battlefields became lifelines. Fathers wrote to newborns they had never met. Sons wrote to mothers, describing rain, food, or memories of home. Husbands tucked pressed flowers or photos inside envelopes. Did you know? Censors often cut out words or sentences, leaving blacked-out gaps in letters that families would hold up to the light, hoping to guess what was missing. Close your eyes and hear the scratch of a pen in a dim barrack, the rustle of a letter opened at a kitchen table, the sigh of a family reading the same words again and again. Not all who left came home quickly. Many men became prisoners in Europe. Power camps held British, French, Soviet, and American soldiers in Asia. Captured men endured harsh conditions in camps across Burma, Thailand, and the Pacific Islands. And yet, even here, daily life continued. Makeshift soccer games with rag balls, secret plays staged on wooden planks, prayers whispered in a dozen languages. Did you know? Some prisoners crafted chess pieces from bread, or carved violins from scrap wood, clinging to small pieces of humanity amid captivity. Close your eyes and hear the clang of a camp gate, the murmur of foreign voices, the faint tune of a song carried by men who refused to surrender their spirit. Back home, not all men went to war. Teenage boys too young to enlist worked in fields or delivered newspapers with pride. Grandfathers too old for the front kept shops open, repaired shoes, sharpened tools, and held neighborhoods together. In some places, men unfit for service joined civil defense brigades, patrolling blacked-out streets or manning air raid posts. Did you know? In Britain, the Home Guard, sometimes called Dad's Army, was made up of men too old, too young, or medically unfit for regular service, yet nearly 1.5 million strong. Close your eyes and hear the shuffle of slippers on a cobblestone street, the clink of a hammer in an old man's workshop, and the determination of those who stayed behind to still serve. For families, the absence of men reshaped life in every home. Empty chairs at dinner tables, hands missing from farms and factories, voices missing from bedtime stories. Mothers became both parents at once. Sons grew into responsibilities overnight. Wives took on debts, decisions, and doubts. Did you know? Some women carried photos of their absent husbands tucked into aprons or pinned above the stove, glancing at them as they cooked, as though the silent face might answer. Close your eyes and feel the weight of that silence, not an emptiness, but a presence that lingers, even when the man himself is far away. And at last, the war began to end, and men came home. Some returned with medals, others with scars invisible and unseen. Some never returned at all, leaving families with only memory. In villages across the world, church bells rang, embraces tightened, tears flowed freely. Yet even then, the world was different. Men who left as sons returned as weary fathers. Men who left as boys came back as old. Did you know? In many countries, welcome home dances were held in barns, schools, or town halls, where men and women reunited not only with each other, but with the rhythm of peace. Close your eyes and hear the cheer of reunion, the quiet sob of remembrance, and the slow, tender rebuilding of lives once divided. And so, in this part of our journey, we have followed the footsteps of men, those who marched away, those who wrote letters from the front, those who languished in camps, those too young or too old, serving at home, those who returned, and those who never did. Each story whispers the same truth, that war is not only fought with weapons, but with waiting, absence and endurance. Softly, softly, let these echoes of men fade, as we turn toward the next chapter of everyday life in a world at war. Softly now, let us step closer, not to the battlefield, not to the general's maps, but to the kitchens, fields, and factories. For if the men were away, it was the women who kept the world turning. The war may have been fought with tanks and ships, but daily life was carried on by hands that watched, stitched, harvested, and built. Hands that rocked cradles and hammered rivets, hands that churned butter and mended boots, hands that worked long after sunset, so that life would not unravel completely. Tonight, we step into their world. A world at the very center of survival. Picture the rolling green hills of the English. Countryside stretching under a soft grey sky. Cows graze lazily, but look closer, and you'll notice something unusual for the 1940s. It is not men ploughing the fields. It is women, dressed in trousers, their hair tied back under scarves, their boots muddy and their hands rough from tools. These were the Women's Land Army, known affectionately as the Land Girls. Many were city daughters who had never touched a plough before. Yet now, they rose before dawn to milk cows, mend fences, and dig potatoes from the earth. Listen, can you hear it? The lowing of cattle in the mist, the creak of a wooden cart, and the laughter of women discovering strength they didn't know they had. By 1943, over 80,000 women served in the Land Army. Some drove tractors, others harvested wheat, still others raised pigs in small pens. They worked side by side with older farmers, filling the gap left by sons and husbands sent to war. But their work didn't end in the fields. Back in towns, women lined up in queues for rationed food. They bartered recipes, shared scraps, and became masters of making a meal from nearly nothing. Carrot puddings, dried egg cakes, and endless cups of tea carried families through, and through it all, they found ways to smile. Evenings might bring a dance in a village hall, boots dusted off, cheeks flushed, as a gramophone played scratchy tunes. Close your eyes and imagine the muddy boots by the door, the warm light spilling from cottage windows, and the murmur voices that said, "We will endure." Now, drift across the wide Atlantic. The hum of engines grows louder. The smell of oil and hot steel fills the air. This is the American factory floor of the 1940s. And here stands Rosie the Riveter. Not just a poster on a wall, but a million real women. Some were mothers with children at home. Some were young students. Some were widows already touched by the war. Each donned coveralls, tied a scarf round her hair, and stepped onto factory floors where rivets popped, sparks flew, and machines roared. They built airplanes, ships, and tanks, their hands steady, their backs strong. They learned to read blueprints, to weld, to lift heavy steel, to work 16-hour shifts when needed. By 1945, nearly 1 in 3 American workers was a woman. Each rivet they drove into a bomber wing was a promise, to brothers, to husbands, to sons overseas, that help was on the way. Imagine the scene. A radio playing swing music above the clamor of drills, the scent of hot wool clinging to clothes, the cheer of voices shouting, "We can do it." Not just as a slogan, but as a lived reality. Outside the factories, women also ran businesses, volunteered for the Red Cross, and drove ambulances. Life had expanded. The war had pulled them into roles long closed off, and once opened, those doors would never fully shut again. For East, in the vast, frozen land of the Soviet Union, the demands were even greater here. Women did not only replace men in factories or fields. They went to the front, snipers, machine gunners, tank drivers, and pilots. The most feared were the Night Witches, a regiment of female pilots who flew outdated wooden biplanes. At night, they cut their engines, gliding silently over German camps. Before dropping bombs with terrifying precision, the sound of their planes was like the whoosh of a broomstick in the dark, hence the nickname, whispered by German soldiers in fear. Others served as medics, crawling under fire to pull the wounded back. Some were only in their late teens, yet they carried stretchers heavier than themselves, their breath steaming in the icy night. Back home, Soviet women took over farms, sewing circles and factories, keeping food and weapons flowing even as bombs fell on their cities. Imagine it, the bitter cold biting at skin, the whine of aircraft overhead, the steady breath of women who refused to yield, who became both the shield and the sword of their nation. Now let us move softly across the seas to Japan. Here, too, women bore the weight of absence. With men conscripted, mothers and daughters managed households under strict rationing. Rice was stretched with barley or millet. Firewood and kerosene were scarce. Many joined neighborhood associations, organizing bucket brigades against their raids, digging trenches and sewing uniforms from scraps of fabric in homes lit by dim lanterns. Women patched clothes again and again, making each garment last another season. They comforted children shaken by the boom of distant bombs, whispering lullabies to soften the fear. Theirs was a quieter form of strength, unseen in battle reports, but deeply felt in every household that carried on through scarcity, and so, whether in Britain's muddy fields, America's roaring factories, Russia's frozen front lines, or Japan's candlelit kitchens, women stood at the very center of survival, hands that harvested potatoes, hammered rivets, flew bombers, and soothed fevers. Hands that stretched meals, wrote letters, raised children, and buried the lost. History often remembers the battles, the speeches, the victories. But the world itself, the steady pulse of daily life, was carried on women's shoulders softly. Softly, as you breathe, remember this, though war tore the world apart. Women stitched it back together, piece by fragile piece, and in their strength, we find one of the quietest, yet most powerful stories of all. Softly now, let's open an envelope. Not the envelope itself, not even the words written inside, but the feeling of it, the weight of paper held between fingers, the scrape of a fountain pen across its surface, the pause between sentences where a writer thought of the person far away. In wartime, a letter was not just a letter. It was a voice carried across oceans, mountains, and borders. It was the difference between silence and connection. During the Second World War, billions of letters were written. Soldiers scribbled by candlelight in trenches. Wives sat at kitchen tables with cups of tea gone cold. Children printed awkwardly on lined paper. Every letter was both fragile and immense. Fragile because it was only paper and ink. Immense because it carried hope, reassurance, or sometimes the unbearable weight of goodbye. Close your eyes and imagine the sound of paper unfolding. That crinkle was often more powerful than a speech on the radio, more healing than news in the papers. In villages across England, in towns across America, in faraway farms in Australia or South Africa, the most anticipated sound of the day was the rattle of a postman's bicycle, or the knock of his hand against a wooden door. Families paused, conversations stopped, hearts leapt. Would today bring news? For mothers, the arrival of the postman could mean a surge of relief, a letter in familiar handwriting, proof that a son or husband was still alive. For others, it could mean silence, no envelope, no word, and silence stretched heavier with each passing day. In some households, letters were read aloud. In others, they were read privately, folded back, smoothed, tucked into aprons, or slipped beneath pillows. Some were carried in pockets until the paper frayed. Imagine the ink smudged by the sweat of a soldier's chest or the tear of a wife's cheek. Even unopened, a letter carried weight. Its very presence meant, I exist. I think of you. I am still here. Now let's move to the soldier's side of the story. Picture a man crouched in a dugout, pencil stub in hand. Round him, mud presses close, boots squelch, artillery rumbles in the distance. But on his lap is a piece of paper. He begins. Dearest Mary, the words are plain. Sometimes stiff, often repetitive, soldiers were not writing novels. They were grasping for a connection. They wrote about meals eaten, about the weather, about memories of home. Many avoided describing the horrors round them. Why? Because they wanted to protect the reader, to keep them from worry. Censorship also played a role. Letters were examined by officers. Anything to revealing of troop movements, battles, or morale was cut out. Literally snapped with scissors. Some letters arrived with holes in them, blank spaces where words once were. Families learned to read between the gaps. But despite censorship, soldiers poured themselves into their writing. They enclosed pressed flowers, snapshots, even doodles of camp life. A single sheet of paper could be crowded with tiny lines to save space. Ink was precious, time was scarce, yet writing was essential. For many, writing letters was the only way to preserve sanity, to feel human amid inhuman circumstances. Now think of those at home. Writing a letter was often the most important ritual of the day. Housewives wrote in the quiet after supper. Once children were put to bed, fathers wrote in careful script, telling sons of the crops, of neighbors, of local gossip. Children, urged by teachers, wrote clumsy words like, "I miss you, Daddy," or "Come home soon." The act of writing was both comfort and torment. Comfort, because it felt like speaking to the absent. Torment, because after the ink dried, the waiting began. Would it arrive? Would he ever read it? And if he did, how long until his reply made the long journey back? Letters traveled slowly, by ship, across dangerous seas where submarines prowl, by air, in fragile mailbags slung into bombers or cargo planes. A message written in June might not reach its destination until August. Replies crossed paths like ghosts. A soldier answering a letter his wife had written 3 months earlier. Her words already out of date. Imagine the patience required. Imagine rereading the same letter a dozen times, memorizing each sentence because there was no telling when another would come. For those separated by prison camps or by occupied borders, the International Red Cross became the bridge. Prisoners of war could send tiny postcards, often no more than a few lines. "I am well. I hope you are safe. Do not worry." That was all. Families clung to those sparse words as if they were gold. Sometimes Red Cross letters carried devastating news, confirmation that someone was missing, or that someone had died. Yet even then, the paper itself was proof that a human connection remained, however thin. And in occupied Europe, where ordinary post was censored or restricted, the Red Cross often carried the only possible messages across borders. These small slips of communication mattered more than volumes of newspapers or propaganda. Among the billions of wartime letters, countless were love letters, tender, hesitant, sometimes passionate, sometimes restrained. A soldier wrote to his fiancée, "When I close my eyes, I see you. When I wake, it is with the thought of our wedding day. This war cannot last forever. Hold on." A nurse wrote to her sweetheart overseas, "Your absence is everywhere, and yet your presence fills every moment. I carry you in every quiet hour." These letters often became keepsakes, tied with ribbons, hidden in drawers, read long after the war was over. For some, they were the only record of a love that never reunited. For others, they became the seeds of marriages that carried on for decades. Close your eyes and picture a folded letter carried in a breast pocket over the heart. Not just words on paper, but a shield against despair. Children, too, were part of this great web of correspondence. They drew crayon pictures, scribbled uneven letters. Some schools organized collective efforts, sending bundles of cheerful notes to soldiers abroad, for a father far away. The sight of a child's crooked handwriting could bring both joy and pain. Joy, because it was proof of growth, of life continuing. Pain, because he had missed the very moments those letters described. First steps, birthdays, new teeth, school plays. Yet even these small notes mattered. They tethered families across oceans. They said, "You may be far away, but you are still Dad, still Mom. Still ours, not every letter made it. Ships sank. Bags were lost. Bombs destroyed postal depots. Some families received months of silence not because their loved one had died, but because the words meant for them lay at the bottom of the sea, and some letters arrived too late. A soldier might receive his mother's letter months after she had already died. A wife might open an envelope only days after receiving a telegram of her husband's death. The cruel irony of timing made people feel heavy with grief. Even so, people kept writing, because silence was worse, because hope was stronger than despair. When letters did arrive, their reading was often ceremonial. Families gathered in kitchens or parlors, lamps lit, curtains drawn, voices hushed. The words of the absent were heard aloud, sometimes broken by tears, sometimes by laughter. A wife might read her husband's jokes about military food. A mother might smile at her son's complaint about his itchy uniform. Children might squeal with delight at a father's mention of sending gifts once the war is over. The words themselves were ordinary, but their effect was extraordinary. They were bridges between worlds. Now imagine the earth itself covered in invisible lines, like threads in a tapestry. Each thread a letter traveling from one place to another, from farmhouses to battlefronts, from camps to cities, from islands to capitals, billions of threads crossing, tangling, fraying, mending. This was the real lifeline of the war. Not only supplies, not only weapons, but words. The historian might count battles and dates, but the everyday world was shaped by letters, by the daily rhythm of writing, sending, waiting, receiving, reading, by the hush of kitchens and the scratching of pens, by the sigh of relief when the postman finally came. So let us fold this chapter as one folds a letter. Picture an envelope sealed, its edges worn, its stamp pressed by foreign hands. Imagine it traveling across seas, clutched insects, carried by trains, sorted by tired clerks, until at last it arrives at a familiar door. A knock, a hand, an envelope passed across a threshold. In that moment, the war paused. Time shrank. Distance closed. A father, a son, a wife, a daughter. For a few moments, they were together again. And that, perhaps, was the quietest yet most enduring act of survival, to keep speaking, to keep listening, across the impossible distances of a world at war. Let's begin, not with silence, but with a sound. A scratch, a hiss, a faint crackle, the sound of a needle meeting vinyl. Then, slowly, the swell of music. In kitchens, in barracks, in cafes, in hospitals, in factories, this sound carried through the warriors like a pulse. When the world itself was unsteady, music gave rhythm. When lives were fractured, music stitched moments together. It did not stop bombs. It did not end battles, but music allowed people to breathe. It gave them permission to laugh, to cry, to sway, to remember who they were. Step into a living room in 1940. There in the corner sits a large wooden cabinet. Inside, a glowing dial. The radio. Families gathered round it nightly, as if it were a hearth. The air hummed with static before a voice broke through. The BBC, or the American networks, or stations across Europe when signals carried far enough. After the news, after the speeches, came music. It might be a cheerful dance band, a crooning ballad, or a spirited march. Whatever it was, it filled the room with something larger than fear. In Britain, Vera Lynn's voice floated from these radios. She became known as the Force's sweetheart, singing We'll Meet Again and the White Cliffs of Dover. Her voice was not just notes, it was reassurance wrapped in melody. Families clung to her songs as if they were personal promises. In America, Glenn Miller's orchestra swung across the airwaves. In the mood, Moonlight Serenade, Chattanooga Choo-Choo, the rhythm made people tap their feet, forget the headlines for a while, and imagine a world that still swung with joy. The radio gave not just information, but atmosphere. It reminded people that life was more than ration books and air raids. Now picture a dance hall, the floor polished, the ceiling draped with bunting, the band at one end tuning their instruments. The room is crowded, soldiers on leave. Young women in dresses patched and altered but made to shine. Older couples rediscovering a youthful step. When the band strikes up, the floor comes alive. Feet move, skirts sway, laughter echoes. Outside, the blackout curtains hide a dark world. Inside, there is only music, only the rhythm of bodies moving together. In London, dance halls were packed even during the Blitz. Bombs might fall, but people still danced. In small towns across America, the Saturday night dance was a ritual. On Pacific Islands, soldiers built makeshift dance floors, gramophones spinning records under palm trees. Dancing was not denial, it was defiance. To dance in wartime was to declare, we are alive, we will keep living. In the humming halls of wartime factories, music carried a different role. Women working long shifts at lathes or sewing machines found energy in rhythm. Radios played over loudspeakers, keeping time with the clatter of tools. Songs about trains, love, or home became soundtracks to endless hours of labor. The government even encouraged it. Music kept morale high, productivity steady. A catchy tune could shorten the wait of a 12-hour shift. Workers sang along, sometimes in harmony, sometimes off-key. A chorus rising above the whir of machines gave the work a sense of unity. The war effort wasn't just steel and fuel. It was also voices reached together, filling empty spaces with melody. On the front lines, music traveled with the men. Harmonica players slipped into foxholes. Accordions appeared in unexpected places. Soldiers sang marching songs to keep step, parodied popular tunes to vent frustrations, and hummed lullabies to quiet fear. In barracks, evenings might end with a circle of men singing softly. Not professional performances, just human voices finding strength together. One soldier later recalled, it wasn't the notes themselves. It was the sound of everyone joining in. You felt less alone. You felt part of something. In prisoner of war camps, music became even more powerful. Prisoners built makeshift instruments, wrote new songs, and held concerts. To sing was to resist despair. To make music was to insist that they were still human, still free in spirit. In hospitals, music entered quietly but worked deeply. Nurses hummed to calm the wounded. Bands played in wards, lifting spirits of men lying in beds lined with white sheets. Sometimes music stirred tears, sometimes laughter, Sometimes silence, but always it reached places medicine could not. For those learning to walk again, a tune gave rhythm to halting steps. For those learning to live with loss, it gave moments of peace. Doctors noticed what people already knew. Music mended. Not bones, but the fragile fabric of the spirit. For civilians far from battlefields, music defined daily life. Children skipping ropes sang rhymes, their voices echoing in courtyards. Mothers hummed lullabies while sewing or queuing for food. Men whistled tunes walking to work, creating fleeting moments of normalcy in extraordinary times. On farms, radios played while cows were milked and fields plowed. In small apartments, gramophones spun until the needles dulled. Music filled cracks of silence, keeping the weight of uncertainty at bay. It said, "Life continues. We are still us." It wasn't only joy. Governments understood music's power. In Nazi Germany, jazz was banned, labeled degenerate, yet underground clubs kept swinging. Defying the ban with saxophones and clarinets in the Soviet Union, music was carefully curated to inspire loyalty and sacrifice, but censorship could not silence. Melody entirely, even in the darkest places, forbidden rhythms found their way into hearts. Secret dances, hidden records, whispered songs, they thrived. Because music is difficult to cage. Music also carried romance. Couples danced before parting, songs becoming their shared memories. A man on a train platform might hum the tune he and his sweetheart last danced to. She might replay it at home, each note a connection across distance. When soldiers married before shipping out, music filled the ceremonies. Hymns, love songs, even the nervous laughter of a piano playing off-key. These songs outlived the war, woven into the very fabric of memory. When peace finally came, music carried the celebration. Crowds danced in the streets. Bands played until their lips ached. Radios poured out triumphant. Symphonies, but long after victory, certain songs remained forever tied to the warriors. For a generation, to hear Violin or Glenn Miller was to be transported back, to air-raid shelters, to crowded dance floors, to nights of waiting and mornings of relief. Music became memory. Memory became history. Why speak of music in a time of war? Because wars are not only fought with guns. They're endured with spirit. And spirit needs sound. Music was the heartbeat beneath the headlines, the melody behind the statistics. It was the background to rationing, the counterpoint to loss, the harmony to survival. Even now, decades later, if you listen to those old recordings, you can hear it, the scratch, the hiss, the crackle, and then the voice, not just a singer, not just a band, but a world reminding itself. Over and over, we are still alive. Softly now, let us step into the silence after thunder. The guns have quieted. The bombs no longer fall, and yet, for millions of ordinary people, the war lingers in empty chairs. In cracked walls, in ration books still tucked in drawers, picture London. 1945, the rubble still lies in heaps, bricks scattered like fallen dice. But on a quiet street, a kettle whistles, a woman, tired-eyed but smiling, pours the cups of tea for the first time in years without the fear of silence. Across the table sits her husband, thinner, quieter than before, but home at last. Did you know it would take years for rationing to end in Britain? Bread wasn't fully free again until 1948, and sweets only came back in 1953. Even in peace, patience was required. Close your eyes and imagine the clink of teacups, the grey London sky outside the window, and the tentative warmth of a new beginning. Now drift across the channel to a French village where the fields, scarred by tanks and trenches, are planted once more. Wheat sways in the breeze, and children run down dirt roads barefoot. In the square, bells ring freely again, announcing weddings, baptisms, and simple Sunday gatherings. Did you know? In many liberated villages, church bells had been silent throughout the occupation. Forbidden to ring, their sound in 1944 and 1945 was more than noise. It was joy, defiance, and rebirth. Imagine the smell of fresh bread, the laughter of children chasing a dog, and the low hum of life stitched back together, thread by fragile thread, far away, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The aftermath looked very different. Entire neighborhoods lay flattened, and survivors. The Haibusha carried scars both seen and unseen. But even here, daily life began again. Shopkeepers set up stalls among the ruins, women cooked rice when they could find it, and children played with toys carved from scrap wood. Did you know? Some of the very first new buildings in Hiroshima were schools. Education became a symbol of moving forward, even in the shadow of loss. Close your eyes and hear the echo of children's voices rising where silence once reigned, a fragile but unbreakable sound. Across the ocean, in the United States, men returned from battlefields to cities that had never known bombing raids but had been transformed all the same. Factories shifted from tanks to cars. Women who had riveted planes and ships were told to step aside, and parades filled the streets with confetti and brass bands. But in kitchens and porches across the nation, what mattered most was the knock at the door. A father, a brother, a son, stepping across the threshold, greeted by hugs that seemed they might never end. Imagine the creak of a porch swing, the glow of a radio tuned to jazz, and the relief of voices saying you're home now, you're safe. And so, across the world, in 1945 and the years just after, life stretched itself awake. Gardens were replanted, clothes were mended again, not for lack, but for thrift. Music returned to taverns and dance halls. Lovers walked hand in hand at dusk, whispering of futures that finally seemed possible. Did you know? In Italy, in Greece, in Poland, and far beyond, festivals returned as acts of joy and defiance. To light lanterns, to dance in the street, was to say, we are still here. Close your eyes and let the images drift through you, the soft thud of a loaf of bread kneaded and baked, the rustle of wheat fields bending in the breeze, the chatter of markets alive once more, the silence of remembrance and the hum of hope. And so, as we leave this journey, we remember World War II was not only armies, not only speeches, not only victory and defeat. It was the quiet entrance of ordinary people who endured, who adapted, who carried life forward even in the darkest of times. Softly, softly, let that truth stay with you. History is not only thunder. It is the whisper of resilience that lingers long after the storm. And when the war finally loosened its grip, what lingered was not only the ruins of cities or the silence of graveyards, but the small, enduring memories of ordinary days for many. It was the memory of letters, carefully folded, read again and again until the creases were thin. For others, it was the smell of ersatz coffee or bread made without butter, scents that would forever be tied to entrance. Children remembered running through streets half paved with rubble, finding play in the brokenness. Mothers remembered blackout curtains folded away for the first time, letting sunlight pour back into rooms that had felt like caves. In Germany, women who had stood in endless queues never forgot the sound of empty pots. In Britain, families who had planted victory gardens often kept on gardening, unable to shake the lesson that every scrap of food mattered. In Russia, The survivors of sieges carried in their bones the memory of winters endured by sheer willpower. And yet, mingled with grief, there was also a kind of tenderness. Songs hummed in shelters became lullabies long after. Photographs carried in wallets during years of absence became treasured keepsakes. Even the ration books, once symbols of limits, became relics tucked into drawers, reminders of how much could be endured and how much could be shared. The war ended, but its rhythm echoed on. In every corner of the world, people carried forward not just scars, but stories, quiet, ordinary, resilient stories, the kind of memories that slip into family tales, told across tables, whispered before bedtime, shaping how generations understood not just war, but the stubborn heartbeat of life that had persisted through it, softly. Let those memories drift with us now, as if history itself were reminding us. What matters most is not the battles won, but the lives carried forward, and so our long wandering through the everyday life of war comes to rest. We have walked through ration queues in Britain, where mothers counted every ounce and children grew up on ingenuity. We have drifted through occupied streets in Europe, where silence carried both fear and defiance. We have listened to the heartbeat of villages in China, the call of markets in Cairo, the hum of Canadian kitchens, the thunder of Indian trains. We have stood on islands and faraway farms, among sheep and sugarcane, taro and coconuts, each place reshaped, but never erased by war. We have seen men gone, and men who stayed, women who carried nations on their shoulders, children who played between shadows, families who bore absence as if it were another member at the table. And at last, we have heard the quiet of aftermath, the stillness after storms. When memories began to weave themselves into the fabric of ordinary life once again, all these pieces, scattered across continents, across languages, across oceans, belong to one story. Not the story of generals or battle maps, but the story of humanity itself. A story of how people ate, sang, prayed, waited, wept, and dreamed. Perhaps, if you close your eyes, you can still hear it. The clatter of a ration book stamp, the hiss of a kettle, the laughter of children chasing fireflies, the low hum of a song carried across a darkened street. The world at war, yet also the world alive. This is the gentle echo left behind, that even in the hardest of times, life endures. That even in the darkest of nights, there is always the small light of ordinary things. And that history, at its heart, is not only what was fought, but what was lived. Softly, softly, let us set this story down now, and carry forward the reminder that in every age, it is the quiet lives of everyday people that give the world its strength. And that's where we'll leave it for today. Thank you for wandering through history with me, quietly, slowly, the way life itself once unfolded. If you'd like to hear more of these soft journeys into the past, don't forget to subscribe and join me again. Until next time, keep listening, keep learning. And remember, history is never just dates and battles. It is the gentle story of us all.